tea has a long and rich history dating back to ancient China. But when you think about where in the world they drink the most tea now, one country in particular probably comes to mind. It does for me anyway. England, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, whatever you want to call it, those guys, right? They really do love a cup of tea. Tea is notably absent, for the most part, however, in the United States, where coffee reigns supreme. I mean, we have iced tea drinkers here in the South, and you may have a cup of hot tea every now and then, especially in the wintertime. But there is no arguing that tea is anywhere near as popular as coffee in the United States. Why? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back over 250 years to a time when revolution was brewing and tea was not. Let's fix that. Hello, I'm Shay LaFontaine, and this is History Fix, where I tell surprising true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. This episode is launching on Patreon on July 3rd, and for everyone else on July 5th. And so we're really dancing around the important date here, July 4th. July 4th is an incredibly significant date in the U.S., For anyone not well-versed in U.S. history, that's because it was the date that the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. This document declared that the 13 colonies were now independent and no longer under British rule. Of course, they'd have to get through the Revolutionary War first to really take advantage of that independence, which had already started over a year prior in April of 1775. I don't think a lot of people realize that. The war started before the Declaration of Independence was signed. I think people think that they signed it and then that's what started the war. No, it was already going on. But this year, this July 4th is especially significant because it marks the 250th anniversary of the signing on July 4th, 1776, which is seen as sort of the birthday of the United States of America. I don't really know why 250 is so significant. We just like numbers like that, right? It's significant. So I've decided to dedicate the month of July to some stories from around this time and around this event, the birthday of the United States of America. Tea being one of those stories. Because tea, which really means almost nothing to us now in the U.S., tea played a surprisingly large role in inciting the revolution and American independence back in the 1700s. And to figure out why that was, we have to go all the way back to ancient China, actually. Tea, dried leaves brewed in hot water to create a beverage. This concept of tea comes from China originally. There's a Chinese myth about the origins of tea that says that in 2737 BC, which is a very precise year for what is essentially an urban legend. Anyway, the myth says that in that year, 2737 BC, the Chinese emperor Shen Nung was sitting beneath a tree while his servant boiled some drinking water nearby. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew some of the leaves from the tree into the boiling water. Shen Nung was a renowned herbalist, and so he decided to try this new infusion that his servant, with the help of the wind, had accidentally created. Now, this tree that he had been sitting under happened to be a Camellia sinensis tree, which is the type of tree that virtually all traditional teas come from. So when Shen Nung tasted this strange new infusion, he was drinking tea for the first time. Now, is that story true? Probably not, but that's how the legend goes. What does the science say, though? What does the archaeology say? Well, we know they were drinking tea in China at least by the 200s AD because we found containers that once held tea in tombs dating back to the Han Dynasty from that time period. We know that the Tang dynasty, from like 600 to 900-ish AD, tea was a super big deal. Tea was so loved in China at that point that it became something like the national drink during that era. A late 8th century writer named Lu Yu even wrote a book about tea, and he called it Chaching. Yes, Chaching, which means tea classic. The Chinese called tea cha. Soon after that book was written, tea made its way to Japan, likely brought by Japanese Buddhist monks who had traveled to China to study. They were digging cha as well, and so it soon became a big deal in Japan too. But for a very long time, well over a millennia at least, tea remained in the East. Europe had no concept of tea as a beverage. Now, in the Americas, though, they did have a concept of tea developed completely separately from what was happening in China, I want to point out. The indigenous people of what is now the eastern U.S. made yaupon tea for thousands of years using the leaves of the yaupon holly tree, which still grows rampant where I live. It's absolutely everywhere. But Europe, while, they were making like medicinal infusions using herbs and whatnot, they didn't have actual tea for drinking until the late 1500s. That's when we get the very first mentions of tea coming from the Portuguese, some of whom were living in the East at the time as traders and missionaries. And it's likely that these Portuguese traders and missionaries brought samples of tea back to Portugal with them. But it wasn't until the 1600s that tea actually started to be imported into Europe as a trade good by the Dutch, not by the Portuguese. By the turn of that century, the Dutch had encroached on Portuguese trade routes in the east and established a trading post on the island of Java in Indonesia. So today we really associate Java with coffee, but we're talking about tea here. In 1606, these Dutch traders shipped the first cargo of tea from China through Java and on to Holland. And once in Holland, tea started to catch on among the Dutch, but it was very, very expensive, and so it was strictly enjoyed by the very wealthy Dutch. Now, when we think about tea today, it's a very British thing, right? Tea is very British. But up until the mid-1600s, the Brits were sleeping on tea hard. China had been drinking it for possibly thousands of years. The Dutch and the Portuguese were getting into it. France was starting to get into it. Britain really could care less about tea. They were known to dismiss these continental trends. Britain is on an island, and so they kind of did their own thing. They set their own trends, and they didn't really buy into these fleeting continental trends that happened. And so it wasn't until 1658 that we get the first mention of tea coming from a London newspaper called Mercurius Politicus. So it referred to tea as a, quote, China drink called by the Chinese cha, by other nations te, alias tea, end quote. And it's said that it was currently on sale at a coffee house in London called Sweeting's Rents. Now, coffee was not huge in Britain yet either. The first coffee house had just opened in London in 1652, so 6 years before tea is mentioned in this newspaper. But even at this time, it's obvious that tea is very unfamiliar to the readers of this newspaper, and it's something like a novelty, really. So I find that really interesting. Tea and coffee really arrived in London at about the same time. And so just to kind of, for context, tea, when you think of like Henry VIII, right, like the quintessential English king, you want to think about him like sipping tea. There was no tea in the days of Henry VIII. There was no tea in the days of Elizabeth I. Tea came to England, I think, much later than a lot of people realize. Now, 1662 marked a turning point, though. England, Ireland, and Scotland's King Charles II, who was newly restored to the throne after his father was executed and the monarchy was destroyed for a minute there. I've got to cover that at some point. It's been on my mind a lot. anyways, Charles II is sort of like handed back the crown. They're like, okay, sorry we killed your dad. We'll do the king thing again. And he is put on the throne, and he married a Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza in 1662. And Catherine was a big tea fan. Remember, the Portuguese had been at least dabbling in tea since the late 1500s now because of their trading and missionary work over in the East. So Catherine was a great lover of tea. And when she came to Britain to marry King Charles II, she was quite disappointed to find that it wasn't really a thing in Britain, tea drinking, right? She asked for a cup of tea when she sort of disembarked the ship from Portugal, and they were like, we don't know, but you can have some small ale. She was offered small ale instead, and that wasn't what she was looking for. But when her dowry arrived, Portuguese ships loaded with goods that were her dowry, essentially payment to the monarchy, there was a chest of tea leaves included. And so Catherine is responsible for popularizing tea among the English nobility, which caused it to spread, throughout the rest of the country shortly thereafter. So now the English, at least the wealthy ones, are falling in love with tea drinking, just as Catherine had in Portugal. And when it comes to trade goods, where there is demand, there is money to be made. So this demand for tea is sort of starting to rise now. There's potential there to make some money off of this. Enter the East India Company. This was a trading company that, since about the year 1600, had a monopoly on importing goods from outside of Europe. If it was brought in from elsewhere, it was brought in and sold by the East India Company. So after Catherine popularized it in the 1660s, the East India Company started importing tea into Britain. And the first order was placed in 1664 for 100 pounds of tea shipped from Java. And that is where it all began, but it is far from where it ended. Tea absolutely took off in Britain after that, still just among the wealthier folk because it was expensive. The working class could not afford tea. But why was it so expensive, right? It's just dried leaves. They shouldn't be that expensive. Well, it wasn't because tea was like rare or hard to grow or hard to get or anything like that. I mean, it was kind of hard to get. It was hard to get to China from England in those days, right? But it was mostly expensive because of taxes. Tea was heavily taxed by the government. Originally, they tried to tax tea by the liquid cup, but that didn't really make sense because they weren't importing liquid cups. They were importing pounds of dried leaves. So in 1689, they switched to taxing tea by the pound of dried tea leaves. And the initial tax was 25%. But this was so high that it almost stopped sales of tea completely, right? Like it was catching on, but the Brits weren't exactly addicted to it yet, right? They're not going to pay absurd amounts yet. You got to get them real good and addicted to the caffeine, right? And then you can levy whatever kind of insane tax you want. That's the trick with selling drugs, right? I assume. I don't know. I don't sell drugs. But so this initial tax, it was way too high. It was so high, it was at the point where people were about to be like, nah, I'm good on tea, right? In 1692, they lowered it from 25% to 5%. But then, as the addiction grew, so too did the taxes, back on up higher and higher over the years. By the 1700s, the extremely high cost of tea had created a whole nother unforeseen problem: smuggling. People wanted to drink tea, right? They were addicted to it at this point, but they simply could not afford it. And so people started smuggling tea into the country to avoid the tax, which allowed them to sell it at much more affordable prices. According to the UK Tea and Infusions Association, quote, What began as a small-time illegal trade, selling a few pounds of tea to personal contacts, developed by the late 18th century into an astonishing organized crime network, perhaps importing as much as 7 million pounds annually, compared to a legal import of 5 million pounds. Worse for the drinkers was that taxation also encouraged the adulteration of tea, particularly of smuggled tea, which was not quality controlled through customs and excise. Leaves from other plants, or leaves which had already been brewed and then dried, were added to the tea leaves. Sometimes the resulting color was not convincing enough, so anything from sheep's dung to poisonous copper carbonate was added to make it look more like tea. End quote. It's nothing we haven't seen with other drugs, but it's wild to think about this sort of smuggling happening with tea, which seems so proper and innocent. But tea, rich in mind-altering and addictive caffeine, is in fact a drug, just like coffee, just like sugar, honestly. These covert, day-to-day drugs that we don't like to think about as drugs. So it got to the point where they were smuggling more illegal tea into Britain than the East India Company was importing legally. 7 million pounds versus 5 million pounds. So now you've got this affordable smuggled tea or this super expensive legal tea. And people were buying the affordable smuggled tea, right? Because otherwise it meant no tea. So the taxes had gotten so high that they could not afford to buy the legal stuff. And this caused a lot of problems for the East India Company, who by the 1770s was sort of stuck because of all the smuggling. They were stuck with 21 million pounds of unsold tea, which is a 4-year supply of tea. They could not sell the tea because it cost so much more than the smuggled tea because of the taxes, and the smuggled tea was absolutely everywhere. Also, they owed the British government 1 million pounds. So their profits were dropping. They had this surplus, this 4-year supply of unsold tea, and they were in debt to the government. They were in trouble. They were coming very close to bankruptcy. And the government didn't want the East India Company to go bankrupt before it paid them that 1 million pounds that it owed them, right? So something had to be done. Now, until now, the East India Company had not been allowed to export anything, including tea, directly to the American colonies. They could take it to Britain, and then from there, merchants would take it and sell it in the colonies. So the East India Company, in an attempt to avoid going bankrupt now by the 1770s, they go to the British government and they ask for permission to export directly to the colonies. And the British government says yes. They're like, sure, of course, please, yes, do that. Because remember, they want that 1 million pounds that they are owed. And if the East India Company goes bankrupt, they're not going to get it. So the Tea Act of 1773 is passed. And this allowed the East India Company to export tea directly to the colonies. And colonists would pay a 3-penny tax per pound. That was also part of this act. This wasn't a crazy amount, okay? This was not a crazy high tax. It was actually less than what people were paying in Britain. And so it's very likely that the British government did not foresee this being a problem. But it was a problem. It was a huge problem. Not because it was a high tax, because it was a new tax. And the colonists were already near a breaking point with all of the taxes. So, to understand why this new tea tax was so badly received by the colonists, we have to go back a little bit farther to the 1760s, about a decade before this happened. In the 1760s, Britain had just finished fighting the French and Indian War, which had been very expensive. They spent a lot of money fighting this war, and so they were essentially broke afterwards. To remedy that, they had passed a series of new taxes, including the Stamp Act on paper goods in 1765 and the Townshend Acts in 1767, which taxed glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. So there had been a lot of new taxes of late, and the colonists were becoming more and more disgruntled over this because they were paying all of this tax money to the British government, and yet they had no representation in the British government. They had no say over how any of this tax money would be spent. Would the king use it to pave new roads in the colonies, or would he throw a lavish feast? Would he build a new vacation home, right? That sort of thing. They didn't get to say. They didn't get to weigh in. And yet it was their money, right, that they had worked hard for. And that was bothering them more and more with each and every new tax. No taxation without representation. And so the Tea Act of 1773, while not absurd at all financially, was salt in an ever-growing wound. Now, there's an argument to be made that it wasn't just about no taxation without representation, though. It wasn't just about justice and fairness. It was also about business. It was also about finance. Because if you think about it, the Tea Act, it didn't just levy a 3-cent tax on each pound of tea. It also allowed the East India Company to export directly to the colonies for the first time. The East India Company was a notorious monopoly. It had literal monopolies on trade left and right. And so if you think about it, if you're an American merchant and an American trader, and now the East India Company is allowed to come in and do business in your ports, you can't compete with the East India Company. No one can. And so it was about justice and representation and whatnot, but it had to have also been about business, about money, right? As most things are. In response to this Tea Act, many colonists decided that they would just flat out refuse to pay the 3-cent per pound tax on tea. They just wouldn't do it. But the East India Company, desperate, remember, to avoid going bankrupt, pressed on with their plans nonetheless. They loaded 4 ships full of this tea, this 4-year surplus of tea that they had, and they set sail for Boston Harbor in the fall of 1773. And it would take several weeks for these ships, which were called Dartmouth, Eleanor, Beaver, and William. It would take several weeks for these ships to actually reach Boston. And in that time, the colonists sprang into action, concocting a plan. At this point, they know this tea is coming across the ocean. It is on its way. What are they going to do when the tea arrives in Boston Harbor? They know it's got this 3-cent tax on it. They've already resolved that they will not pay the tax. What are they going to do? According to the Massachusetts Gazette newspaper, there was a meeting called in early November in which colonists decided that, number one, they wouldn't buy any tea that they had to pay those taxes on. And number two, anyone who helped the East India Company in any way would be considered a, quote, enemy of America, which seems extreme, but it's like, they're just reaching a breaking point, okay? It's past that. There were several of these heated meetings in the time that it took for the ships to reach Boston, and even attacks on the warehouse where the tea was destined to be stored after it arrived, if it were purchased and brought off of the ships. The Dartmouth was the first of the 4 ships to reach Boston Harbor on November 28, 1773. And when it arrived, the customs officer completed the necessary paperwork for the import of the tea, which meant that legally the ship could not set sail again for Britain with the tea still on board. But then the people of Boston refused to bring the tea ashore if they had to pay that tax. So the Dartmouth is stuck in Boston Harbor. It cannot leave with the tea on board, and the colonists are refusing to take the tea off of the ship. Another ship, the Eleanor, arrived a few days later, followed by the Beaver. Same situation. All 3 ships get stuck in Boston Harbor, unable to leave with the tea, unable to get rid of the tea. And then the 4th ship, William, actually ran aground near Cape Cod, so it never actually arrived in Boston. But the other 3 ships did, and they are stuck. The UK Tea and Infusions Association writes, quote, "There was deadlock. The townspeople would not allow the tea to be brought ashore without an agreement that no duty would be paid on it. The governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, whose sons were to have been agents of the East India Company for the distribution of the tea, refused to let the ships leave port without paying duty on the tea. An armed guard of patriots was posted at the wharf to prevent the tea coming ashore, while a naval blockade of the harbor prevented the ships from leaving. Mass meetings were held by the resistance leaders, Samuel Adams and Josiah Quincy, and the Bostonians were further buoyed up by messages of support which they received from all over New England. End quote. So the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, he was a loyalist. He was loyal to England's King George III. And, as mentioned in that quote, his sons stood to profit from this tea being imported into Boston. They were in cahoots with the East India Company. So he's on the side, obviously, of the East India Company. But the colonists have stationed armed guards to ensure that the tea does not come ashore. They're prepared to take it a step further, too. On December 16th, over 2 weeks after the first ship arrived, it's been stuck now for over 2 weeks, as many as 7,000 townspeople met at the Old South Meeting House to figure out what they were going to do. 2 of the 3 ships that were stuck in the harbor were owned by an American named Francis Roch. And he, of course, attended this meeting. He was in a tight spot. He would face the wrath of his fellow colonists if he brought the tea ashore. Plus he couldn't even do that, what with the armed guards. But he also worried that if the ships tried to leave the harbor illegally without unloading the tea, they would be confiscated or they would be sunk by the Navy. And these are his ships, so he does not want that, right? So Roch, of all people, is desperate for a solution here. The meeting sends Roch as a sort of ambassador, right? They send him 7 miles away to Governor Hutchinson's country house, where he's somewhat holed up, probably waiting for this drama to blow over. Roch goes to see the governor, and he asks the governor to allow the ships to leave the harbor and go back to Britain with the tea still on board. And Governor Hutchinson refuses, right? So Roch goes back to the meeting house. He's like, he said no, he won't do it. He won't let the ships leave with the tea. And there was this patriotic uproar in response. They have tried to solve this problem the right way, and they have been denied, and now they are forced to take drastic measures. That very night, December 16th, a group of colonists assembled on a hill near the harbor. And some of them were dressed as indigenous Americans, specifically from the Mohawk tribe. Their faces were darkened with soot, and they wore, traditional Native American garb and that sort of thing. And they whooped with Indian-style war cries as they approached the harbor. Now, why? Why were they dressed this way? I think people like to think of it as like this homage to America, to the real Americans, right? The indigenous people who lived on these lands for thousands of years, the OGs. It was very American. It was very anti-British, right? To dress up in indigenous clothing and that sort of thing. And that's a nice sentiment. I would be very surprised, though, if that's what they were going for in 1773. We view indigenous people, most of us view indigenous people with a lot of respect and reverence now. That wasn't the case in the 1700s. They were still very much seen as others, as godless savages by white people in those days. And so I don't think they dressed up like Mohawk people to be very American. I think they did it to be intimidating, scary, savages. Who knows what they'll do? Watch out. We're crazy, right? That sort of thing. So I don't think it was exactly showing respect to indigenous people like we like to think it was in hindsight. It was a lot more offensive than respectful, I think, right, in 1773. Anyway, they marched down to the wharf all dressed up and disguised, and they boarded the ships one after another, all 3 ships, and in the span of about 3 hours, they split open the chests of tea, 342 chests in all, and they dumped them into Boston Harbor. Now, despite all the whooping and the war cries and the costumes and the savagery, this was not actually a violent protest. They were pretty chill about it. The ship's crew reported that nothing had been damaged or destroyed except for the tea, and that the protesters even swept the decks clean afterwards. And I don't know if that was them like being considerate or like just trying to get rid of every last tea leaf. I don't know. There's another report in the Massachusetts Gazette that when it was realized that a padlock had been broken, which was the personal property of one of the ship's captains, the men sent him a replacement. So they're clearly not like real criminals, these guys. They're probably mostly like politicians and businessmen who had stake in this, right? They strictly went to dump the tea. They weren't trying to cause any problems outside of that end goal. In the end, these men, and we don't even know how many men there were who participated. Anywhere from 30 to 130 were involved. But these men dumped the equivalent of up to $3 million of tea in today's money into the harbor that night. According to reports, there was still a lot of tea floating in the harbor the next day, so men went back out in rowboats and beat the tea underwater with their oars to keep any of it from being salvaged. They were serious about this. This protest sparked other protests in other colonies as well. Tea being shipped to New York and Philadelphia was sent back to London. Tea offloaded in Charleston was left to rot in the warehouses, never to be sold. But it was the protest in Boston, it was the Boston Tea Party that would set off a chain of events that would eventually lead to revolution. A loss of $3 million worth of tea did not go over well with the East India Company or the British government. And so in order to punish the colonies, but mostly Massachusetts, mostly Boston, for this protest, Parliament passed a series of new acts that were called the Coercive Acts in Britain and the Intolerable Acts in the colonies. There were 4 of these officially. The first one closed Boston Harbor until colonists paid for the tea they had destroyed, which they obviously weren't going to do. So this was crippling to Boston, right? Their harbor is closed, their port is closed. Now no goods could come into or out of the city. That's a problem. The second act put the Massachusetts colony under military rule, giving all power to the British governor. The third act protected British officials who were accused of crimes in the colonies, which had to have led to serious abuses of power, right? They can do whatever they want because they have this sort of like immunity, really. They're protected from being accused of crimes. The fourth act allowed British soldiers to stay in colonists' homes if they needed to. So if that were allowed in the U.S. today, it's not, thanks to the Third Amendment, but if it were, it would mean that some army dudes could just show up at your door one day and literally take your house from you. Just be like, we need to live here and we need to use all your stuff and we need to eat all your food and you won't be compensated at all for any of it. That's what the Fourth Intolerable Act allowed. So this was really too much for the already disgruntled colonists. I feel pretty safe saying that Britain's response to the Boston Tea Party with the passing of these intolerable acts is what incited the whole revolution. There were other factors too, but this was a major factor. In direct response to this, in September of 1774, representatives from all over the colonies met at the First Continental Congress, including Samuel Adams from Boston, who had been part of the Sons of Liberty group that had planned the Boston Tea Party. Now, he didn't take part in the actual smashing and dumping of the tea that night, we don't think, but he was a primary planner of the protest. The First Continental Congress met to come up with ways to resist the intolerable acts, and then it would be followed in May of 1775 by the Second Continental Congress, which would eventually sign the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, and the rest, as they say, is history. The Americans would go on to win the War for Independence in 1783, becoming their own separate nation of mostly people who still refuse to drink tea to this day. I mean, coffee fully reigns supreme in the U.S. We've got our iced tea drinkers down here in the South, but as far as a cup of hot tea, is enjoyed multiple times per day in the U.K., it's just really not done here. And I think a lot of that still stems from those pre-revolutionary conflicts over tea, which is pretty wild if you think about it. But we can't end this without finishing out the history of tea. We know pretty much all of this arguably the formation of a new nation, was caused by high taxes on tea. And we know that those high taxes led to a lot of tea smuggling, which hurt the East India Company because they couldn't sell their more expensive tea and all that. Well, in 1784, just after the Revolutionary War ended, Britain's new Prime Minister, William Pitt the Younger, which, like, what is this, ancient Greece? But this guy, this new prime minister, he lowered the tea tax from 119%, it had climbed up to, down to 12.5%. Considerable difference, right? And this made legal tea instantly affordable, and tea smuggling stopped virtually overnight. I mean, he fixed this centuries-old problem they were having, this very serious problem. They lost their American colonies practically over this. He fixed it just like that. Just boom. Lower the tax. Now we're good. Everybody chill out. And it worked so well. Tea revenue, legal tea revenue grew even higher than it had ever been, and tea consumption in the UK absolutely skyrocketed. 50 years later, in 1834, another big change affected tea. The East India Company's monopoly on trade with China ended. So before that, all of the tea came from China because of that monopoly. But after the monopoly ended, the East India Company, instead of having to deal with competitors in trading Chinese tea, they decided to start growing tea in India, which they had colonized and were essentially governing. I need to do a whole episode about the East India Company because I don't really understand how this import-export company is also governing a whole country and growing their own tea. It was clearly much more than just a shipping company, right? It was a whole thing. It was a whole force. But anyway, they start growing tea in India, in Assam. And then they start selling this new Assam tea in Britain. And it was very successful. By the late 1800s, tea from India became more popular than tea from China in the UK. And with the end of the East India Company's monopoly, there was now competition. And so this led to the rise of the tea clippers. So these were super fast ships, these clipper ships, that competed to be the first to bring their tea to Britain. There was a huge competition, especially between British and American merchants, which led to the clipper races of the 1860s. According to the UK Tea and Infusions Association, quote, "The race began in China, where the clippers would leave the Canton River, race down the China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, up the Atlantic, past the Azores, and into the English Channel. The clippers would then be towed up the River Thames by tugs, and the race would be won by the first ship to hurl ashore its cargo at the docks." But these races soon came to an end with the opening of the Suez Canal, which made the trade routes to China viable for steamships for the first time. End quote. And so it was a short-lived era, this era of the tea clipper races, but I don't know, sounds kind of fun. Today, tea is still a very big deal in the UK, where they have whole times of day set aside for drinking tea. According to statistics, the UK collectively drinks around 100 million cups of tea every day, and this breaks down to roughly 1.5 cups per person per day. Now, if you live in the US, I'd like you to consider, when is the last time you even had a cup of tea? For me, it was probably back in February when I had a cold and was trying to soothe a sore throat. That's what tea has become in the United States, for most of us anyway. That is remarkable. I find it so interesting that a somewhat petty argument over a negligible tax 250 years ago is still affecting our entire nation's preference for hot beverages all this time later. But it was so much more than that. It was so much more than a 3-cent tax on a pound of dried tea leaves. It was about control. It was about liberty. It was about the pursuit of happiness. And I really do think the British underestimated what the American colonists' response to the Tea Act would be. I think they underestimated their passion and their determination to hold their own and to not let this tyrant across an ocean walk all over them. And really, that makes a lot of sense because you have to think about what type of person it takes to leave their homeland, cross an entire ocean on a wooden ship, and settle in a new and often hostile land, most of which was untamed wilderness, right? It takes a particular type of person to do that. And that is who the colonists were. That's who they were. That's who they came from. That's who raised them. They weren't just going to roll over now and pay the taxes because it wasn't just a tax. It was Britain reclaiming the money that they lost in the French and Indian War. It was Britain saving the East India Company to get back their 1 million pounds. It was Britain filling their coffers, all on the American colonists' dime, money that they had worked hard for and forked over for what? Who knows? They had no say. And that wasn't right. In the end, it wasn't about tea and it wasn't about taxes. It was about principle. It was about stamping out injustice. It was about scrapping the old corrupt system and starting anew, building a new system, a system built on liberty and justice and coffee for all. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. As always, source material for this episode can be found in the show notes. Be sure to follow my Instagram @HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.